Why don't you take your Bibles, please, and turn to Deuteronomy. We're coming to the last part of Moses' second address. Does anyone remember what the first address was without looking at the outline? It's been a long time, hasn't it? There's been times we've been away from our class where you say, well, we just studied Deuteronomy Sunday. Well, we should have switched for Sunday for the new quarter. And the reason we do that, because a lot of our teachers switch, and this way they can stay with the adult class and not miss the classes. And so we were to switch to the series on the family. We'll continue that Sunday morning, Lord willing. But tonight we'll get back to Deuteronomy. We'll be on track. But one of the things, back in chapter 4, we started the second address. In Deuteronomy, there are 3 addresses. We're in the latter part of the second address. In the middle of this second address, we find things that are very similar to what we see in chapter 26 of the idea of the bringing the vows to the tithes to Jerusalem, where they were to put away all the idolatrous things that they conquered the country with, put them away, and where the name of Jehovah would be found, where my name will be. What is that a signal of? We study the Old Testament law. We all know, where was his name going to be? Jerusalem. Remember when Solomon dedicates the temple? This is where your name is. You're in heaven, but your name here is in the temple. That's where his authority is. And so they were to bring their sacrifices and tithes, and including tithes, which we're getting ready to look at tonight. They were to bring that a lot of times to the certain tithes where they were to bring to the temple, and they were to offer it. Other times they were going to bring it, as we're going to see tonight, they would be eaten in their own gates. That's not Jerusalem, that's their own gates throughout Israel. So we've got to keep that in mind. So in the middle of this second address, in chapter 12, we see that being brought, and now we bring it at the end as well, and with an additional tithe that we'll talk about. So when we look at in the middle of chapter of this, what they were to do with their first fruits, we saw that in chapter 26. We studied about that last week, and I thought the word gratitude was a good word to sum up those verses 1 following, verse 1 through 11. The idea of gratitude. They have been given the land of promise. They have come to that land, and now they're benefiting from the land, flowing with what? Flowing with milk and honey. And we'll see it also repeated in verse 15 when they bring the tithes, a land flowing with milk and honey. What does that imagery of? What does that mean? A symbolic language. What does it mean? Yes, sir. Yeah, fruitful land, abundant land, flowing milk and honey. That which is we like and would benefit from it. So I want to be able to put those things in perspective of why he brings these. We have the first fruits, and then in verses 12 through 15, we have the tithes at the end of the year. And then we have some interesting things. Have you ever wondered why the tithes are mentioned in verse 12, and all of a sudden at the end of that they're giving they're making their statements of what they have not done through the year, that they have not they've followed the word of God, they have not gone against it. Why is that connected with that tithe at the end of the year? Does that interest you? It interests me. And we're going to try to put that together this evening in our study. So our question is, in the middle of giving of the first fruits, he speaks about, and here's the procedure. Had a procedure. You were to announce the fact that you've come into the land. The priest was to take the wicket basket of your first fruits, and they were to set it before what? Set it before the altar. And when that has it, then you answer. The worshiper answers because of that event, and that's where the gratitude is set forth. But one of the things they say at this in verse 5, and thou shalt answer and say before Jehovah thy God, Assyrian, ready to perish was my father. And he went down into Egypt and sojourned there. And our question number 20, who was the Syrian father to Israel who was ready to perish? Who might that be? Jacob. If we said Abraham, was he a Syrian? You may have, in other passages, you have the Syrian, the Armenian. Aram. When Genesis 10, when the sons of Shem are divided up, well, Aram is one of them. And all throughout that area of Mesopotamia, Aram is Syria. Aram, where his family is Syria. Padaram, field of Aram, Haran. That ought to say, where did Jacob go to escape death from Esau? He was ready to perish. Who was after him? Esau. And his mother said, you go down to Padan-aram. You find Lot, you find my brother. Laban, you'll find him, and you go there until your brother cools down. So for a while, he went there, and he married Leah. He married Rachel. You have the events of Genesis 40. I forgot how many chapters that includes. When you speak about that, Genesis 29 through 31, that he is there. And so my father indeed was ready to perish, and he was the one who was ready to perish, and he goes into that area. He was the Syrian because that's where he dwelt for a while. Jacob did. Abraham was from Mesopotamia. That's the same area. And Mesopotamia is the region, and Haran is where you'd find the brother of Rachel, and that's where he would find his wives. So that's why he calls him Syrian, my father. He went now into Egypt because, see, there's the lineage of the 12 tribes of Israel. My father, and here's the Israelites. Did they go down to Egypt? Yes. And while they were there, you might say, well, they were going to perish if they didn't come there and down to Egypt. They were ready to perish. That not only was with Jacob, who also went there, but the idea of going down to Egypt, were they about to perish if they didn't get food? So all of that's blended there. And you were to say that if you were an Israelite, when you brought down your wicked basket of your first fruits, and giving of the first fruits, have you ever gleaned a tree of fruit and the first fruits that come off there? You find the best, that was to be offered to God, the first fruits, the best of the first fruits. And we talked about that last time, and this idea of gratitude to God. So that was one thing that was to happen as they stand before God, and the gratitude that is set forth there. Verse 10, and now behold, I brought the first of the fruit of the ground, which thou, Jehovah, hast given me, and thou shalt set it down before Jehovah thy God. And see, not only will you set it down, you'll make the statement, but what comes next in this procedure? You've addressed yourself, I'm from the land, I'm come, here's the first fruits. Priest says, I'll put it down here by the altar. It's been set down, and you make your statement. And when it's set down, after you do that, you worship God. I thought all parts of life was worship. You go through the Bible, you'll find there are certain times where you weren't worshiping and now you worship. Every bit of life is worship unto God. There's a sense that everything we do is for the Lord, but worship is distinguished even in that context. There were times when he went up to worship God. He went over here to worship God. If worship is every facet of your life, how could you go and start worship? Our lives are dedicated. We serve God, and sometimes this service gets into worship. And in the Roman letter, chapter 12 will do that, which is your reasonable service. That's your service. And a lot of that had to do with your worship term that's used there. So there's a sense of how that works, but they worship God. That was distinguished from everything I do in my life. It was distinguished from that. And notice, thou shalt rejoice in all the good which Jehovah thy God hath given unto thee, and unto thy house, thou and the Levite and the sojourner that's in the midst of thee. Why would the Levite and the sojourner, why would he enjoy the tithes or the first fruits that were given unto God? Let's talk about the Levite. Why would they rejoice? David? That's the way God set it up. That's right. There's your tax scholar going to help certain people. And that was there. They weren't working. They were their work. They had their different courses. And notice it was the priest that was there at the time. It might be a different priest at different times because they're always working shifts that they would have. They went an hourly shift, but daily shift, monthly shifts that they would be involved with. So there was an occasion where they would do that. And you go in to possess it, thou shalt take the first fruit, and thou shalt bring it from thy land, Jehovah thy God to give it thee, and put it in a basket, and thou go to the place that Jehovah thy God shall choose. So here is one of those times where you're bringing the tithe. We see it in Deuteronomy 12, right in the middle of this second speech, where that event would take place. And so there's your first fruits. They would be dedicated unto God. And the idea of keeping the temple worship going. So he mentions that here. Now, we go from there, and it says in verse 12, when thou mayest an end of tithing, all the tithe of thine increase, in what year? All right. What was the tithe of the land in the third year to be used? For what was its purpose? If you see the word fatherless and you see the word widow, what might you think? Potential poverty there. And Levite. Levites prospered from other tithes. But this was a tithe that was set for the poor. And it says, at the end of the year, the tithing shall give it unto the Levite, to the sojourner, to the fatherless, to the widow, that they may eat within thy gates. We're not going to Jerusalem. There may be a Levite in that. There's 48 cities dedicated for Levites throughout the land of. You had 6 of the places where they could go if they killed somebody. I think there was 48 cities of the Levites spread across there. They were doing their work and their service unto God. Within their gates, they needed help a lot of times. And this was a matter of poverty. And that's what they were to be given within thy gates and to be filled. Maybe they were a little empty. Maybe they didn't have a lot. And they were to be filled, what we see in verse 12. Now, the next question we have, and this is just one because of how the Jews look at it today, and even how Josephus looked at it. Sometimes the question goes, what was the tithe in the third year to be used? And we say, well, that's for poverty. Well, was this a second tithe during the year? And we answer that, well, was that a second tithe? Or was it the same one that we just talked about in Deuteronomy 12? Let's go back to Deuteronomy 12. It's been a while since we've been there. And let's go to, Deuteronomy 14. Deuteronomy 12 is where we find the middle of it, but here's now, we get into chapter 14, and we covered this. But in verse 28, does this sound like our context? At the end of 3 years shalt thou bring forth all the tithe of thine increase in the same year, and shall lay it up within thy gates. Does that sound like we just read this? The Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with thee, and the sojourner, and the fatherless, and the widow that are within thy gates shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that Jehovah thy God may bless thee in all the work of thy hand which thou doest. There was a tithe that we are connecting now with Deuteronomy 27. What, 26? We've been in. We're 26. So there's no doubt about it. That's verses 12 through 15. But go back with me to Deuteronomy 14. Verse 22, different from verse 28. He says, thou shalt surely tithe all the increase of thy seed, which cometh forth from the field year by year. Not once every 3 years, year by year. Thou shalt eat it before Jehovah thy God in the place which he shall choose. There's where a lot of times you would be going to Jerusalem. There would be that time to help the temple. It says, it shall be thy grain, thy new wine, thine oil, thy firstlings of thy herd, of thy flock, that thou mayest learn to fear Jehovah God always. That was a different tithe. So if verses 12 through 27, one tithe, what would be verses 28 following? Would that be your second tithe? Is that, I'm trying to nod, blink, raise your hand, do something. I don't want you to miss this, because there's three. Would this be the second tithe? I think it would. Then why does Josephus, why does he mention the fact that there are three tithes? And a lot of the rabbis speak about three tithes. And it's because that they looked at this second tithe as a tithe for festivals. There was the first tithe that would be there for the temple worship and the idea of temple and taking care of them. That's where the Levites, the Levites would have to tithe of what they got from the first tithe, and they would have to give that to the priest. They would tithe the tithe. They'd be tithing the tithe, which the Deuteronomy speaks about. So that was the first tithe. And then when you came for feast occasions, that would be the second tithe that would be taking place, and for festivals, and then the one for the poor at the end of the year would be this third tithe, which is the second, because they don't speak about the festivals. Because when you came there, you could say, I want to be giving something that's too far to travel, so I'll bring some money and I'll buy something. I'll buy wine, I'll buy this, buy flocks and all that sort of thing. Too much to carry it down. That's when they were going to their feast days. And they would offer their tithes connected with that. So really you have three tithes. If you count the Levite tithing the tithe, there's a fourth tithe that they would be involved with. But really they look at three tithes. Josephus speaks in his book on the Jews. He specifies them. There's the tithe and the tithe of the festivals, and then this is the tithe of the poor. When is this occurring? First of the year, middle of the year? What indication would you have of the time that this is occurring? When thou hast made an end of tithing all the tithes of thine increase in the third year, which is the year of tithing, then thou shalt give it unto the Levites to sojourn within thy gates. So it's idea, here's not every year, that's where the other tithes were taking place, but every third year, that would be a tithing for the poor. And when they got through with that, as if all my tithing has been done, my first fruits, that's been done. Even to place of the temple, at the end of all the feast days where tithing would take place. This seems to be summing up my work of the year. Tithing, first fruits, and everything like that. But they've done that. And I think when you see the timing of that, you say, oh, I know now. Because why is it that in verse 13, thou shalt say before Jehovah thy God, I put away the hollow things out of my house. Also I've given them unto the Levite, and unto the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all the commandments thou hast commanded me. This is that third tithe coming probably at the end of the year, and it sums up all that I've done this year. And you make this testimony before God. You can do this in your tent. It's nothing indicating here you're in the temple. Remember, they're being fed from you in the gates. I have not eaten thereof in my mourning, neither I put away thereon being unclean, nor given thereof for the dead. We'll come back to that verse. I have hearkened to the voice of Jehovah thy God. I've done according to all that thou hast commanded me. Look down from heaven and bless thy people, Israel, and the ground which thou hast given us, thou swearest unto our fathers, a land flowing with milk and honey. There's that refrain again. When you say that at the end, when you look back at what you've done that year, and tithe what God has blessed you with, first fruits from the land. A lot of the tithing was grain. Part of Deuteronomy, the fleece of the sheep, not just sheep themselves or the herd mostly, but there would be the fleece of the sheep. You know, Levites needed to be warm. And that was part of their tithing. And when he got through, he said, I've done all you commanded. And we've already seen that when you give the first fruits, you make a speech to God, you're worshiping God. You're saying, this comes from my heart. The priests aren't telling me to say this. This is what I'm to say from my heart. And you're there at the altar, temple, Jerusalem, where my name is, the places he's chosen, and you're offering that. But here, you may be sitting in your tent, and you've done that. And to me, because what connection does this have to do with the Levites, the poor being helped with your tithe? I did not eat by mourning to death. Well, I didn't think you were to eat it. I thought we're to give it. What connection does that have? It sums up your year. And it sums up that special every 3 years, where it was for the poor. Now it fits. Now it fits in my mind. I hope it fits in yours. Now, what are we talking about? I have put away their being unclean. I have not touched dead bodies. I have not eaten while being unclean. I have not eaten because in times of mourning for the dead. Was that a sin? Hosea 9:4 says it is. People weren't to do that. They're unclean. If they touched a dead body, they'd be unclean. The things that was hallowed unto thee, O God, I have put away therein being unclean. I haven't touched that when it is hallowed unto God. When it was hallowed unto God, you were not to eat that in times of mourning because it was a day of rejoicing. See, rejoice. You're polluted it. It's not bad that you're sorrowful for your loved one who's died, but this was dedicated as a tithing to God for a joyful occasion. So you're not doing that at that. I'm not eating thereof in my mourning, because it was supposed to be a rejoicing thing. Neither have I put away thereon being unclean. I haven't taken it out of my house to do that, nor have given thereof for the dead, causing them to maybe be encouraged to eat while they're mourning. Or it could be idolatry. I don't know. It's hard to tell what they think about. These idols are dead. They're not alive, and you're giving that, tithing unto the idols. A lot of different views about that. But it could be that, and the idea that you're not helping other people to sin either in doing that. And he says, I have hearkened to the voice of Jehovah. I've done according to all that thou hast commanded me. Look down, bless us, and a land flowing with milk and honey, so we can do it again the next 3 years down the road on this particular tithe. So this is considered the second tithe. Some would say, this is the third tithe. And the main tithe was where a lot of times they would be in Jerusalem and offer that there. Any questions on the tithing? What is a tithe? How much? What might it be? Maybe a tenth? Tithing means a tenth. And of that tenth, you're going to have the Levites giving 1/10 of his tenth that he got. And that's what tithe is. Does God want you to tithe today? It's interesting to look at all the material denominations, how they will go in detail with the character, the principles of this tithing, and they'll fit every one of their goals for the church connected with tithing. The Bible doesn't command you to tithe, doesn't tell you to. What does God command us to do today about giving? What does the New Testament say about giving? Tithing, do you ever read that? Give cheerfully, but give as you prospered. Your journey has been well. How well? Well, that's a relative term. You give as you've been prospered. And we got examples of people in their poverty. They gave out of their poverty. But they did cheerfully. And the money amount is not the point. It's the fact that what can I give back to God that He's journeyed me, have a good journey so far. And it was a daily offering that was given to support preaching the gospel. And but denominations, they'll have all the different views. It's interesting to read their books upon that. But the New Testament says not a tenth. We're not going to get down to herbs and cumin and anise and take a tenth of that and see who's right or wrong. You'll give as we prosper, and that's going to be from your heart. All right. Any comments you'd like to add to that? All right. Verses 16 following of chapter 26. Here we find Moses summing up his second address, and we ask this question. Well, let me get through that. Does anyone have any deal about the dead in verse 14? We covered that. Now, 24. Moses' conclusion of his second address, what do you learn? And I just divided this up, and you can, to make it easier through this, because you can get this. I might go through this whole second speech, and no, just read his conclusion. It's very interesting. What do you learn regarding how one should keep the law of God? In verses 16 through 19. How should you keep the law of God? With all your heart? No, that's what you love God with. Aren't you to love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, strength? We say it all the time. Yeah, we got it. But you're to keep His law with all of your heart and soul. Duty. I've got plans, law. Maybe you don't love Him with all your heart and soul if you chafe at that. We embrace it. Whatever you say, Lord, we're going to do. I'm going to give all of my heart. That includes my love. And love and commandments do not go together. Oh, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. That's if you already love me, you'll keep my commandments. That's not what love is. It's what love does. Read the passage closer. But the point is that here we see the connection with the law, that you're going to give it with all of your heart to the law, the commandments. Yeah, love is going to be involved because I love God. This is what I'll do. Because why? My heart you got. New Testament, Old Testament, some of these things just bring together. He wants your whole heart. And I love you, God. I love you there better, God. But here's a commandment a little too tough for me. And I'm not going to really put forth much effort to do that one. That's not what an Israelite was to do. And he's finishing this up in his speech, that's exactly what you do. Now, let's look at the next one, part B. As to what is involved when one makes Jehovah his God. When you make Jehovah your God, what does Moses say you will do? Yes, you walk in His way. Verse 17. Thou hast avouched Jehovah this day to be thy God, and that thou wouldest walk in His ways, keep His statutes and His commandments and His ordinances, and hearken unto His voice. God, you're my God. Well, you walk as I direct you to walk. He's God, we're followers. And that's a part that goes together as well. Any comments on that? All right. Pretty self-explanatory regarding how God views His people. Here's what my heart should be like. This is what indeed I'm calling you my God. Well, what is involved when God calls you? He looks at His people. What does He say? What does He see with His people? Yes, they're special. It's interesting what He says about this. Avouch unto thee this day to be my people for His own possession. That means special. a people for my own possession. You could read holiness in there. You don't belong to anybody else. Bride, I'm your husband. Your possession from me. But it means you're special in my eyes as God's people. You're going to keep the commandments. Verse 19. And to make thee high above all nations that he hath made, in praise and in name and in honor. You're above all the other nations. You're special to me above all the nations. And then finally, that thou mayest be a holy people unto Jehovah thy God, as he has spoken. Holy, special to God. He's out separated unto himself above all the nations. Does Peter kind of get close to that in describing New Testament Israel? New Testament Christians? Turn with me to First Peter, the second chapter. I think he nails it. And when we see this, we usually go to Exodus 19. You're getting into the law, and if you do this, you'll be a kingdom, a priest, and holy. And yeah, that's where we find the answer. But see, when Moses sums up his commandments and his recognition of God, he brings out just another view, but he encompasses it all. So in 1 Peter 2 and 9, but ye, speaking about the Christian people, nation, but ye are an elect race. I chose you for the foundation of the world. You're elect race, a royal priesthood, kingly priesthood. We've got a king, and we're all priests. You look at the context, see that. A holy nation, yeah, that's what Moses said about Israel. A people for his own possession, that's what he said about Israel. But we're Israel. And you'll show forth the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And now you're my people, special to them. All of that harmonizes. And when people say Israel over in Jerusalem, Middle East, it's God's people. And he blessed them with the land. All that's true. But when the law was nailed to the cross, who nailed it to the cross? Jesus, God nailed it to the cross. Jesus is crucified. It brought an end to that law. And now who is his people? Who is his people? We are Israel. We are God's people. We are to be holy. We are special to God. And that's not bragging. It's just what an honor to be in Christ and be a part of his eternal purpose. And so we bring on, the New Testament brings on the focus, and I just marvel. That's what he said about the Old Testament Christians, and that's what he says about us now. And his second address ends. And we get ready to go to his third address, a little bit shorter. Let's go to chapter 8. Question number 1. What was to be written on stones when God's people crossed over the Jordan into the promised land? What was to be written on stones? The law. Everything Moses commanded that God had written, when he's in Mount Oreb. So we might think stones were, let's quick. What was the plaster to be applied to the stones? Got to write the law. What was to be applied to the stones, and why? You wanted a white surface, gypsum, lime, kind of like mortar and cement. Does he tell you how many stones that are put together? Well, I assume there are 2 because there's 10 commandments. What if there's 613 commandments? That's how many commandments are in the Old Testament for the Jews. A little over 613. Well, you think he'd have to write every one of those things, inscribe them, but they'd have their plaster, and notice when he starts this, it shall be on the day when you shall pass over the Jordan, in the land which God hath given thee, thou shalt set up great stones and plaster them with plaster, and you're going to write on them, inscribe upon them the words of the law when thou passed over. It could have been the 10 Commandments. It could have been, because this is really going to be taken to a place where they're going to be establishing, and where in the Ten Commandments does it say, don't lead a blind man in a way that'll cause him harm? What Ten Commandment is that? It's not there. So, he could have put on, inscribed every law, and you just put stone after stone after stone after stone together. But here's where I want us to get our minds. When you cross over the Jordan, you were to take these stones and you inscribe this law. You're going to put them in Mount Ebal, and there's going to be cursing and there's going to be blessing uttered upon that mountain. All that's going to be occurring when you cross the Jordan. Well, we've studied Joshua. And if you say in that day, when you cross over, that's when you're going to happen. Well, it doesn't mean in that very day that you crossed over the Jordan. Because there were some other stones being picked up that day when they crossed over. What were they? Memorial stones. Memorial, yeah, you're going to write the law of God in them. No. There are going to be 12 of them. And they're going to dig it out there where the floodwaters are going, where the Ark of the Covenant is that separated the floodwaters. People walked across. That's going to be a memorial. You're going to tell your children. That's where we walked over the Jordan, and God allowed us into this promised land. Nothing about the law of God being written. So they cross over the Jordan in Joshua 4. Where do you read about this event in Joshua? Joshua 8. What happens between Joshua 4 and Joshua 8? Jericho. They're sending spies. Jericho. Taking Jericho. Faltering at Ai. Coming back to take Ai. And after all of that, it's when they get these stones. And sometimes I read that, and I say, well, right across the Jordan, they're going to get the law of God. Get that first. No, there's a lot of time passes. So sometimes day doesn't mean 24 hours. Every time you see day, creation, creation context, you got a point. But sometimes the Bible speaks about day in general terms. That day when you're gone over, when they crossed the Jordan, did they cross parallel to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim? Or were they crossed a little bit south and east from that? Traveling. And what we see here, these are, I don't know how many there were, but they could get as many as they want to fit this law. And that's what they did on that occasion. And I think we'll have to stop there. We'll have those questions back up. Why was an altar to be constructed of unhewn stones? So we'll start there. Question number 3, hopefully next Wednesday evening. And I appreciate your attendance.